1871. The German Empire has just been proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The specific choice of location, a deliberate insult to France, whose defeat in the Franco-Prussian War has just made German unification possible. Otto von Bismarck stands behind Wilhelm III. The princes and generals of the German states surround them. A new nation, or rather, the claim that a new nation is actually a very old one, finally restored. The Holy Roman Empire had been dissolved in 1806 by Napoleon. The new German Empire, its architects claimed, was not a creation of 1871. It was a restoration. The Third Reich, the word times Reich, times simply meaning empire, continuing the first and the second, and to make that continuity legible, to give it historical depth, emotional resonance, the specific weight of a promise fulfilled. The new empire reached back 6 centuries to the most powerful and most mythologized emperor it could find, Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, who had been dead since 1250, who had, according to a tradition that had been building for 6 centuries, never really died, only gone to sleep in a mountain in Thuringia, waiting for the moment when Germany needed him and would call him back. The monument at Kyffhäuser was built to announce that the moment had arrived, that the call had been answered, that Wilhelm I was Frederick II returned. This is the oldest trick in the political handbook, the claim of continuity with a predecessor who was too dead to disagree. Frederick II, one of the most complex, most contradictory, most genuinely difficult to categorize rulers in medieval history, had spent 6 centuries being claimed by people who needed him to be whatever they needed him to be. He could not object. He was dead. The monument was the latest in a very long series of Frederick II impersonations, and not the last. Frederick II was born on December 26, in Jesse, in the marsh, not Sicily, though Sicily was the heart of the kingdom he would inherit. His father was Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, the son of Frederick I Barbarossa, whose name and legend would later merge with his own in the Kyffhäuser myth. His mother was Constance of Hauteville, Queen of Sicily, heiress of the Norman kingdom that had ruled the island since the 11th century. By birth, Frederick II was the intersection of 2 of the most powerful political traditions in medieval Europe, the German imperial tradition of the Hohenstaufen dynasty and the Norman Mediterranean tradition of the Sicilian kingdom. He was 3 years old when his father died, 4 years old when his mother died. He became, at the age of 4, King of Sicily, nominally under papal guardianship, actually largely on his own, navigating the specific dangers of a child king in a kingdom full of ambitious regents and rivals. He survived. This should not be underestimated. The specific competence required to survive a medieval minority, to reach adulthood with your throne and your person intact, was not guaranteed. Many child kings did not manage it. Frederick managed it, and what the experience of managing it produced in him was a man with no illusions about power, about what it required, what it cost, what forms it actually took beneath its official justifications. He emerged from his minority with a mind that was, by the testimony of contemporaries on all sides, genuinely exceptional, and with a temperament that was, by the same testimony, genuinely difficult. Stupor mundi, the wonder of the world, was not simply a compliment. It was an acknowledgement that this man did not fit any available category, that he was astonishing in ways that were not always comfortable, that to be in his presence was to encounter something that the normal vocabulary of medieval kingship did not quite capture. The relationship between Frederick II and the papacy is the central conflict of his political life, and the central reason why the myth that grew up around him took the forms it did. Pope Innocent III had been Frederick's guardian. Pope Gregory IX excommunicated him twice. Pope Innocent IV excommunicated him again and declared him deposed, called him the Antichrist, the beast of the apocalypse, the enemy of God. Frederick XIII called the Pope a moneylender in clerical robes. The conflict was not merely personal. It was structural. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope occupied positions that were theoretically complementary, the temporal and spiritual heads of Latin Christendom, and practically incompatible. Each claimed a supremacy that the other denied. The donation of Constantine, the forged document we examined in episode 2, was one of the key texts in the argument about who outranked whom. Frederick II did not accept papal supremacy over temporal rulers. He was not subtle about this. He made his position clear in actions and in words, and he was excommunicated for it. And he continued to make his position clear after the excommunication, and he was excommunicated again. The excommunications meant that his enemies, the papal party, the Guelph faction, had every ideological reason to portray him as evil, the Antichrist, the beast, the man who had placed himself outside the community of the faithful. His allies, the Ghibelline faction, the imperial party, had every reason to portray him as Lairo, the defender of imperial dignity, the man who had stood up to a corrupt and overreaching papacy, the emperor who had achieved what crusaders could not, Jerusalem, return to Christian access, without bloodshed. Both portraits were available in 1250. Both were simplifications of a man who was neither a beast nor a hero, in the uncomplicated sense that political propaganda requires. When Frederick II died in December 1250, both portraits were in circulation, and both portraits needed him to continue to exist in some form, to do their work. The papal portrait needed him as a warning. This is what happens to those who defy the church. The Ghibelline portrait needed him as a promise. This is not over. He will come back. He will finish what he started. Both needs produced a mythology, but it was the second one that lasted. Warnings need a villain, promises need a hero, and heroes do not stay dead. The rumors began immediately. Within months of Frederick's death, the Ghibelline party, the imperial faction that had supported him and that now faced the prospect of a Europe without the emperor, who had been their leader and their symbol, began to circulate stories. He had not died. The man who died at Castel Fiorentino was a substitute, a double placed in the castle, while the real Frederick escaped. He had gone east, to the court of the Sultan, where he was known and respected. He had gone to a mountain. He was in hiding. He would return. These stories were not believed by everyone. The historical record preserves significant skepticism. Contemporaries who noted that the body had been seen, that the burial was documented, that the stories of survival were wishful thinking by people who could not accept that their emperor was gone. But the stories persisted, not because they were true. No serious historian considers Frederick II's death doubtful, but because they served a function. The function was political. The Ghibelline cause did not die with Frederick II. The conflict between imperial and papal authority, the conflict that Frederick had been the most visible and most dramatic champion of, did not end in December 1250. But it needed a figurehead. It needed a continuing argument for why the imperial position was not simply defeated. A dead emperor could not provide that. A sleeping emperor, an emperor temporarily absent. An emperor who would return when he was needed, could. The myth of Frederick's survival was not irrational. It was the specific, purposeful deployment of a narrative to serve a political need. The people who circulated these stories understood, on some level, what they were doing. They needed the emperor to be not dead. They told stories in which he was not dead. This is not the same thing as lying. It is closer to something more interesting and more durable. The construction of a narrative that performs a function the truth cannot perform. The truth that Frederick II was dead, that his cause was in disarray, that the Ghibelline party would need to find new leaders and new arguments was not useful. The alternative, that Frederick II was merely absent, that he would return, that the cause was not over, was very useful. In the competition between true and useful, useful tends to win, at least in the short term, and sometimes for 6 centuries. The impostors were not the most important form the myth took. The impostors were the crude version, the version that required a living body, a face, a voice that could be heard and therefore examined and therefore exposed. The sophisticated version required no living body. It required only a mountain, the Kifhäuser, the specific geography of the myth, the sleeping emperor in the mountain, the beard growing through the stone table, the raven circling outside, the knights in armor waiting with him, appears in its developed form in the 13th and 14th centuries, in the folklore of the German-speaking lands, attributed not consistently to Frederick XIII, but sometimes to him, sometimes to his grandfather, Frederick I Barbarossa, sometimes to both. This merging of the two Fredericks, the fusion of Frederick II and Frederick Barbarossa into a single sleeping emperor, is one of the most revealing features of the myth's development. The historical Frederick II and the historical Frederick I Barbarossa were two different people, different personalities, different policies, different relationships with the papacy, different legacies. The myth did not care. The myth needed a sleeping emperor. It found two. It combined them. This is how mythology works, not with the precision of history, not with the care for accuracy that distinguishes one person from another, but with the economy of archetype. What matters is the type, the sleeping king, the promised return, the mountain, a specific identity. Frederick I or Frederick XIX was a detail. The archetype was the point. And once the archetype was established, once the mountain had its sleeper, and the sleeper had his beard, and the beard had its table, the myth became independent of any specific historical figure. It became a container, a form, waiting to be filled by whoever needed a sleeping emperor in the next century, or the one after that. Before we follow the myth through its subsequent centuries, there is one more thing to establish about the man at its center, because the myth works, the specific myth of Frederick II, as distinct from other sleeping king myths, partly because of what Frederick actually was. Most sleeping king myths attach themselves to figures who were straightforwardly heroic in their lifetimes. Arthur of Britain, Charlemagne, Barbarossa himself in some versions, figures whose legacies were uncomplicated enough to serve as simple inspiration. Frederick II was not like this. Frederick II was excommunicated. Frederick II negotiated with Muslims and was comfortable in their company, more comfortable, some contemporaries suggested, than in the company of his own Christian clergy. Frederick II conducted experiments on living people. The chronicler Salim Bene di Adam records several, though their authenticity is debated. Frederick II wrote poetry in Sicilian Italian, helping to establish a literary tradition from which Dante would later drink. Frederick II kept a harem. Frederick II wrote a book about birds that is still cited by ornithologists. This is not the biography of a simple hero. This is the biography of someone who generates argument, who forces the people who encounter his record to decide what they think about the distance between effective leadership and moral purity, between intellectual brilliance and political ruthlessness, between the man and the image. And this is precisely why the myth works. A simple hero offers only one version. Frederick II offers many. Each person who needs him, each century, each political movement, each nationalist project confined in his actual biography, some element that serves their purpose. The Ghibellines found the anti-papal emperor. The German Romantics found the first German patriot. The nationalists found the strong leader. The liberals found the tolerant multiculturalist. The myth is capacious, because the man was complex, because he left enough material for every subsequent generation to construct a different Frederick. Not the man they needed to invent, the man they needed to find. He was always there, in the record, in the tomb in Palermo, dead since 1250, still available, still being used, still, in some sense, not staying dead. Frederick II died on December 13. He was buried in Palermo. His tomb can be visited today. It is very clearly a tomb. It contains a body. The body has been there since 1250. None of this has ever stopped. The other story, the one about the mountain, the one about the beard, the one about the return, because the other story is not about whether Frederick is in his tomb. The other story is about what the people telling it need to be true. And what they need to be true changes every century. That is the specific mechanism of this episode. Not fabrication, not amplification, projection, the casting of a need onto a surface that is conveniently unable to talk back. The decade after Frederick's death, the 1250s, produced no single coherent Frederican myth. It produced many competing stories, told by many competing people, each serving a different purpose. The Ghibellines told the story of the emperor in hiding, the tactical withdrawal, the strategic absence, the return that was coming. The papal party told the story of divine judgment, the heretic emperor struck down, the Antichrist defeated, the church vindicated, the neutral observers, if there were any, in a conflict this total, told the story of a great man, flawed and brilliant, gone too soon. None of these stories agreed with each other. All of them agreed on one thing, that Frederick II had been too large a figure to simply disappear into his tomb. That something, some continuation, some consequence, some echo had to be expected. The papal story expected judgment, the continuing punishment of those who had followed him. The Ghibelline story expected return, the man himself or his cause, or both. The neutral story expected legacy, the long shadow of a remarkable reign, cast forward into a diminished future. All three expectations were, in their different ways, fulfilled. The punishment came. The cause continued. The shadow was long, but the story that lasted, the story that is still being told in the monument at Kyffhäuser, in the academic biographies, in the footnotes of every history of the Holy Roman Empire, was the Ghibelline story, the return story, the story of the sleeping emperor who would come back, not because it was more accurate, because it was more useful, because the need it answered, the need for the cause to be not finished, for the promise to be not broken, for the leader to be not gone, was a need that could be renewed in every subsequent generation. The papal story's need was specific to 1,250. The neutral story's need was historical, looking backward. The return story's need was always present tense, always now, always the current crisis, requiring the current return. It could be reused indefinitely, and it was. By the early 14th century, the Frederican myth had begun its most significant transformation. The transformation was geographic and social. Geographic. The myth moved north, away from the Italian cities, where the Ghibelline cause had its original political home, toward the German territories, toward Thuringia specifically, toward the Kyffhäuser hills that would give the myth its most enduring physical form. The reasons for this shift are complex, but one element is clear. The political situation in Italy had changed sufficiently that the specifically Italian version of the Ghibelline cause, the northern Italian cities, versus the papacy, no longer had the same urgent need for a sleeping emperor. The conflicts had evolved. New alliances had formed. New enemies had replaced old ones. The specific political function that Frederick's myth had served in 1260 was less relevant in 1310. But in Germany, in the German-speaking territories, where the question of imperial identity and national cohesion was becoming increasingly pressing, the myth found new soil. The social transformation was this. The myth became popular, not in the sense of widely known. It had always been widely known, in the specific way that political stories become part of general knowledge, but popular in the sense of becoming a story told by and for ordinary people, not just Ghibelline nobles and their clerical chroniclers, but craftsmen, merchants, peasants, the whole vast majority of medieval society that had no political investment in the specific dispute between emperor and pope, but that had every reason to want a story about a powerful protector who would come back and fix things. The sleeping emperor in the mountain became, in this period, something different from a political argument. It became a folk myth, a story about justice, about the return of order, about the specific hope universal in human culture, appearing in every tradition, that the good king is not gone, only resting, that things will not always be this bad, that someone is coming. The Ghibelline version needed Frederick to come back to defeat the Pope. The folk version needed Frederick to come back to feed the hungry, punish the oppressors, restore the peace. Two different Fredericks. Same mountain, same beard on the same table, different reasons to believe. The 14th century produced two developments in the Frederican myth that require specific attention. The first, the merger with Barbarossa. Frederick I Barbarossa, Frederick II's grandfather, had his own legacy, his own political significance. his own relationship with the question of imperial authority versus papal authority. He too had fought the papacy. He too had been excommunicated. He too had died in Lavenda 90, drowned crossing a river on the Third Crusade, at the age of approximately 67, in circumstances surrounded by just enough uncertainty to give legends something to work with. By the mid-14th century, the two Fredericks were merging in the popular imagination. The sleeping emperor in the Kiffhäuser was sometimes Frederick II, sometimes Frederick I, sometimes both, a composite figure who combined the qualities of both historical men into something larger and simpler than either of them was. This merger is historiographically important because it reveals something about how myths work that historians tend to find professionally uncomfortable. Myths do not care about accuracy. The distinction between Frederick I and Frederick II, a distinction that any competent historian would insist upon. The 200 years of separate history makes factually significant, is irrelevant to the myth. The myth needed a powerful sleeping emperor. It found two. It merged them. The result was more powerful than either original because it combined the specific qualities of each in whatever proportion the current need required. When the myth needed an emperor who had fought the papacy, it emphasized Frederick II's qualities. When it needed an emperor who had gone on crusade, it emphasized Frederick I's. When it needed both, it used both. The composite figure was more flexible than any historical individual, more durable, more available to more purposes, and therefore more dangerous in the specific sense that something is dangerous when it can be claimed by any sufficiently motivated party. The second development, the fake Fredericks multiply, Tilekolopinda Benecus Sexans, had been one of the first. In the 14th century, the pattern continued, men claiming to be Frederick II, or claiming to act in his name, or claiming to be the agents of his imminent return, appeared with enough regularity to suggest that there was a persistent market for this claim. Not a large market, not a market that ever produced a sustained political movement of the kind that could actually threaten established power, but a persistent market indicating a persistent need. Each fake Frederick was evidence of the same thing, that there were always people for whom the myth had enough explanatory power, enough emotional charge, enough connection to the specific frustrations of their specific moment that they would follow whoever made the myth present and embodied, not because they were credulous, because they were desperate, or angry, or both, and because the myth, the sleeping emperor, the return, the promise of a justice that the current order was failing to provide, answered something real, even when the person claiming to embody it was a merchant from Nos who would be burned in 1285. The 15th century brought the myth into contact with a social force that its Ghibelline origins had not anticipated, the grievances of the rural poor. The German peasantry in the late 15th century was living under a specific constellation of pressures, the enclosure of common lands, the tightening of serfdom in some regions, the increasing burden of taxation from both secular lords and the church, and the specific injustices that accumulate when a large class of people has no legal recourse against a small class and makes the law. These were not new grievances. Peasant grievances in medieval Europe were structural, built into the system. What was new in the late 15th century was the specific combination of these grievances with two other factors: the spread of literacy, made possible partly by the printing press that we examined in episode 4, and the availability of a religious vocabulary, the vocabulary of apocalyptic Christianity, that gave the grievances cosmic significance. The peasants were not simply poor. They were living in the end times. Their suffering was not simply unjust. It was the tribulation that preceded the coming of the just age. And the just age was not simply a better politics. It was the kingdom of God, coming soon, possibly very soon. Into this environment, this specific combination of material grievance and apocalyptic expectation, the Frederick myth moved, not cleanly, not through a single text or a single preacher, through the specific, distributed process by which ideas find the conditions in which they are most useful and settle there. The sleeping emperor was a good fit for the apocalyptic peasant imagination, because he was both political and sacred, because he promised both the reform of the current order and the inauguration of a new one, because his return could be understood as both the restoration of good government and the beginning of the end times. He was the figure at the intersection of the peasants' two vocabularies, the political and the apocalyptic, which made him more useful to them than almost any other available symbol. Thomas Müntzer. The name requires introduction because it belongs to someone who is one of the most important and most contested figures in German religious history, and who is not always given his place in the history of the Frederick myth. Müntzer was a radical theologian, a preacher, and ultimately the military leader of the German Peasants' War of 1524. 1525, the largest popular uprising in German history before 1848. He was not primarily a Frederician. His theology was his own, a specific, intense, and by contemporary standards, extremely radical reading of Christian eschatology that placed the imminent transformation of the social order at the center of Christian obligation. But Müntzer operated in a culture saturated with the imagery and expectations of the returning king, in which the Frederick myth provided a ready-made vocabulary for the hope he was preaching. The just age is coming. The oppressors will fall. The faithful poor will inherit the earth. The king who sleeps will wake. Whether Müntzer himself invoked Frederick explicitly is a matter of historical debate. The myth was available. The myth was in circulation. The people he was preaching to had grown up with it. The specific contribution of Müntzer and the Peasants' War he helped lead to the history of the Frederick myth is this. It demonstrated what the myth could produce when it was attached to a real social movement with real military force. The Peasants' War was not caused by the Frederick myth. It was caused by the specific material conditions of the peasantry, by the revolutionary implications of Luther's theology, which Müntzer radicalized, by the specific political situation of the German territories in the early 16th century. But the myth, the expectation of a just return, the framework in which the current oppression was not permanent, but was the darkness before a promised dawn, was part of the atmosphere in which the war became possible. The Peasants' War was defeated. Müntzer was captured, tortured, and executed in May 1525. Perhaps 100,000 peasants died in the conflict or its suppression. The just age did not arrive. The king did not wake. The mountain remained quiet. And the myth continued, as it always continued, because the defeat of a movement does not end the need that produced the movement. It intensifies it. The sleeping emperor had not come. Clearly he had not yet been needed enough. Clearly the time had not yet come. He was still there, still waiting. The beard still growing. The ravens still circling. The time would come. The 16th century transformed the context of the Frederick myth in ways that neither the Ghibellines of 1250 nor the peasants of 1525 could have predicted. The Reformation, Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority, posted in Wittenberg in 1517, developed over the following decades into a movement that permanently fractured Western Christianity, created a new political landscape in Germany, in which the Frederick myth found yet another function. In the new Protestant territories, the papacy was no longer the supreme religious authority. The specific conflict that had defined Frederick II's political life, emperor versus pope, had been reframed. The question of who had authority over German religious life was now an open one. In this context, the Frederick myth evolved again. The anti-papal dimension, always present in the Ghibelline version, became more explicit. Frederick, in Protestant retellings, was the emperor who had seen through the corruption of Rome, who had stood up to the Pope before Luther did, who had understood 6 centuries early what Luther was only now, making universally clear. Frederick II became, retroactively, a proto-Protestant. He was, of course, nothing of the sort. He was a medieval Catholic monarch who quarreled with specific popes over specific political questions, who never questioned the theology of the Church, but only its political authority over secular rulers. But the myth did not require accuracy. The myth required relevance. And in the context of the Reformation, a Frederick who had defied Rome was very relevant indeed. Each century, a new Frederick. Same mountain, same beard, different ideology projected onto the sleeping figure. This is the full shape of what this episode has been tracking. Not a static myth, but a dynamic one. A myth that changes every time the people who need it change what they need. A myth with no fixed content, only a fixed form. The form of the waiting king. The form that can be filled with any political content that the current moment requires. The most durable myths are the empty ones, the ones that hold their shape across centuries, precisely because they have no specific meaning that can become outdated. The sleeping emperor means nothing specific. That is why he has meant something to everyone who needed him for 600 years. But 1600, the myth of Frederick II, had been in continuous operation for 350 years. It had served the Ghibellines. It had served the peasants. It had served the Protestants. It had served every group that needed a powerful figure from the past to legitimize their claim on the future. In each case, the service was the same. The myth provided a name, a form, a set of images, the mountain, the beard, the ravens, the specific geography of waiting that gave the need a historical anchor, not a new hope, a very old hope, a hope with a specific name attached, a name that had the weight of actual historical significance, of a reign that had genuinely mattered, of a figure who had genuinely been one of the most remarkable rulers in the history of medieval Europe. The name gave the hope gravitas. The hope gave the name durability. Neither could have survived without the other. Frederick II had been dead for 350 years, but 1600. He was more useful in 1600 than he had been in 1250. That is the specific economics of the mythology of the returning king. The longer the wait, the longer the beard, the more powerful the promise of the return. The mountain was still there. The emperor was still sleeping. The beard had been growing for 3.5 centuries. The 19th century was going to need it to have grown a great deal longer still. Heinrich Heine, one of the great German poets of the 19th century, a man of sharp intelligence and considerable skepticism, wrote about the Frederick myth in ways that are still worth reading. He wrote about it with admiration for what it was, a genuine expression of popular longing, a real piece of the German imagination, and with unease about what it could become. Heine was a German Jew. He understood, better than many, the specific dangers of a nationalism that grounded itself in the myth of the returning king, in the promise of a restored greatness, in the identification of a people with an imperial past, in the specific emotional architecture of a culture that believed itself to have been diminished from its rightful stature and to be awaiting restoration. He saw, in the mid-19th century, something that would not fully arrive until the 20th, that the energies being channeled into the construction of German national mythology were not neutral energies, that a nationalism built on the imagery of sleeping emperors and promised returns and restored imperial greatness was a nationalism that had built into it, structurally, a grievance that could not be satisfied because the greatness being promised had never quite existed in the form it was being imagined, because the restoration could never match the myth. He wrote, "There will come a time when something very bad will happen in Germany." He was not specific. He could not have been specific, but he was right. The Frederick myth, beautiful, durable, capacious, was also in the wrong hands, in the wrong political moment, with the wrong level of state investment behind it. Dangerous. January 18. Etienne Babet-Clichy, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Wilhelm I of Prussia is proclaimed German Emperor, Deutscher Kaiser, in the palace of the defeated enemy. The specific staging, the German princes surrounding him, Bismarck in the background, the French royal palace as the backdrop for the announcement that the German Empire has replaced France as the dominant power on the European continent. Every element of this staging is deliberate. The location is not accidental. The timing is not accidental. The specific imagery, German unity, German greatness, Germany taking its rightful place in the hierarchy of nations, is not accidental, and neither is the myth that is immediately invoked to give the new empire its historical depth. The Hohenstaufen, Frederick II, the sleeping emperor in the mountain, awake at last. The new German empire positions itself not as a creation of 1871, but as a restoration. The Third Reich, the Third Empire, continuing the Holy Roman Empire of the Hohenstaufen, brought into being by the man who embodies the promise that Frederick II made and could not keep. Wilhelm I is Frederick the Candid. The myth is not a metaphor. It is a political claim. The monument at Kyffhäuser will make it stone, will make it permanent, will make it visible from 20 kilometers away, and in doing so, in making the claim permanent and monumental, it does something to the myth that the myth had never experienced before. It closes it for 600 years. The myth had worked because it was open, because the emperor was still sleeping, because the return was still pending. because the promise was still unredeemed. The tension of the unredeemed promise was the myth's power source. The monument declares the promise redeemed. The emperor has returned, in the form of Wilhelm I, in the form of the German Empire, and a myth whose promise has been declared fulfilled has a specific problem. What happens next? When the empire fails, when Wilhelm II loses the First World War, and the German Empire collapses in 1918, the myth is ready. Not as a fulfilled promise, as a betrayed one. The emperor had returned. He had been defeated, not through his own failure, through betrayal, through the specific enemies who had undermined him from within. The myth, which the monument had tried to close, opens again, with more grievance than before, with the specific emotional charge of a promise believed, fulfilled, and then taken away. The most dangerous form of the returning king myth is not the one that waits. It is the one that has waited, arrived, and been defeated. That one needs someone to blame. The 20th century did two things to Frederick II that neither the Ghibellines nor the German Romantics had done. The first was appropriation. The Nazi movement did not make Frederick II a central figure of its mythology. That role was more fully occupied by other historical figures, other imperial dreams. But Frederick was present in the cultural surround, in the historical imagination of a movement that needed Germany's past to be as great as its future was promised to be. The specific irony, and it is an irony so complete that it requires an moment's attention, is what Frederick II would actually have thought of the movement that used his name. Frederick the Hind spoke Arabic. Frederick the Kenda corresponded with Islamic philosophers and treated their answers as intellectually worthy of engagement. Frederick the Kenda governed a multicultural Mediterranean kingdom in which Christians, Muslims, and Jews held positions at court. Frederick the Kenda was excommunicated by the church that the movement in question was trying to co-opt as a national institution. The Frederick II of history was, in almost every specific respect, the opposite of what the movement that used his image was trying to create. The myth had eaten the man. The empty form had been filled with content so completely opposed to the historical figure that the historical figure was no longer visible. This is the most extreme version of what projection does to its subjects. It does not merely simplify them, it inverts them. It produces, from the same materials, the same name, the same mountain, the same beard, a figure who contradicts the figure it claims to represent, and the historical figure cannot object. He is in his tomb in Palermo. He has been there since 1250. He is not available to say, that is not me. That is not what I was. That is not what I stood for. The dead cannot correct the myths built on them. That is the specific advantage of the dead as political symbols. The Kiffhäuser monument still stands. You can visit it. The stone Frederick is still at the bottom. The stone Wilhelm is still at the top. The inscription declares, the promised return fulfilled. The promise was not fulfilled. The empire ended. The myth continued. Frederick II has been the anti-papal emperor, the folk hero of the poor, the proto-Protestant reformer, the founder of German national identity, the embodiment of German imperial destiny, the icon of multicultural medieval tolerance. He has been all of these things in the 600 years since his death. He was none of them, not entirely. In his life, he was a specific person, with specific decisions, specific failures, specific achievements, a specific mind, working on specific problems, in a specific century. The myth required him to be a type, a container, a shape that could be filled with whatever the filling required. He was too specific to be a type. He was too human to be a symbol. But he has been both for 600 years, because the dead cannot insist on their specificity, because the living always need something that the dead are available to provide, and because the mountain is still there, the beard is still growing, the ravens are still circling, and someone, somewhere, is still waiting for the return. They are always waiting. That is the one thing the myth got right. The waiting never ends, because the return never comes, because the return was never the point. The waiting was. The returning king is the oldest myth in this series, older than Geoffrey of Monmouth, older than the donation of Constantine, older than the blood libel, older than the printing press, older, probably, than writing itself. The myth of the hero who has not died but only retreated, who is present somewhere, waiting, gathering strength, and who will return at the moment of greatest need, is documented in cultures that have no contact with each other. It appears in forms so structurally similar, across distances so great, that historians and anthropologists have spent careers debating whether it represents a single originating myth that spread across the world, or whether it is independently generated, produced by the same underlying human psychological need in every culture that faces the question of what happens when good leadership is lost. The answer, probably, is both. The myth spreads, and the myth is also independently generated, because the need that generates it is universal. The need is this: every human community occasionally reaches a point where its current leadership is inadequate to its challenges, where the problems are greater than the people who are supposed to solve them, where the gap between what is needed and what is available is too wide to be bridged by any ordinary political process. In those moments, in the specific emotional experience of a community that believes its greatness has been interrupted, that its rightful place has been taken from it, that the current order is a diminishment from what it should be, the returning king myth is the most available and most satisfying answer. Not because it is true, because it answers the need precisely, because it says, the greatness you remember, or imagine, or were promised, it is not gone. It is only sleeping. It will come back. You will not have to build it. You only have to wait, and recognize it when it arrives. The waiting is passive. The recognition is easy. The promise requires nothing except belief. This is, structurally, the most comfortable myth available to a community in distress, and the most dangerous. Frederick II died on December 13. He was buried in Palermo. His tomb is red porphyry. It is very beautiful. You can visit it today. The tomb says, he is here. He has been here for 700 years. He is not coming back. The mountain says, he is there. He will come back when the time is right, when Germany or Europe or the world needs him enough. The tomb is correct. The mountain has been more powerful. 7 centuries of the mountain. 7 centuries of the beard growing. 7 centuries of people who needed a hero in reserve, a hero who had not failed, who had not disappointed, who could not be questioned, finding in a dead emperor exactly the hero they required. The pattern is not specific to Germany. The pattern is not specific to the Middle Ages. The pattern is the specific shape of what human beings do when their present is inadequate to their needs, when they reach backward into a mythologized past and pull forward a figure who can be made to represent the future they want. The figure cannot object. The figure is always dead. That is not a coincidence. That is the requirement. A living figure has opinions, has contradictions, has failures, has the specific inconvenience of being an actual person rather than a useful shape. A dead figure has only what we give them, only the qualities we select, only the parts of their record that serve the purpose. Frederick II was one of the most complex human beings of his century. The myth made him simple. That is what myths do. That is what projection does. It takes the complicated and makes it available, takes the specific and makes it general, takes the human and makes it a symbol, and the symbol, emptied of the specific, stripped of the contradictions, freed from the limitations of actual humanity, is infinitely more useful than the person ever was. That is why the king never stays dead. Not because of anything the king did, because of what we need him to be. The king is in the mountain. The king is always in the mountain, because we need him to be there. And what we need, that has not changed in 700 years. That will not change in the next 700. The mountain is permanent. The need is permanent. The king stays in the mountain as long as the need remains, which is to say, always.